These are the top 5 simplest poker tips so that you can start crushing low stakes, no limit Texas Hold'em. The first tip is don't try to force anything. You really can play a straightforward game at low limit poker. We're talking about 1-2, 1-3, and 2-5 no limit Texas Hold'em. The player population in general is just so bad and they're making so many mistakes. They're just handing money to you. Just accept it. Play your hand straightforward, bet for value, fold to their aggression, check back bad flops. What I mean by that is if you were the pre-flop aggressor with ace-king and you get 2 callers and the flop comes out like 8-7-6 with 2 hearts and you don't have any hearts, there's just no reason to continue in this spot because they're not folding enough to your continuation bets anyways. You're just going to blow up the pot, make it tougher for you on the turn to make a decision. These are spots where you could just simply give up, lose the minimum, and wait for a better spot. That's a key thing, is wait for a better spot. You don't need to take marginal spots like you do in higher limit games. And that's the problem. I think a lot of low limit players are watching live streams and poker on TV where it's higher stakes, and you see these players making flips, making thin hero calls, stuff like that, because they have to, because that game is a tougher lineup. The players are more educated, they're more experienced, they're not making as many mistakes. So they have to take every thin piece of equity that they can get in the long run to win in that game. But in low limit, you don't have to do that. So just remember that. Play your hand straightforward. Don't try to get tricky. There's no need for it. Tip number 2 is don't slow play your hands. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't slow play all the time. Just know when it's appropriate to do it and when it's not. Because in low limit poker, the population is just, they're overcalling and they're also under betting. What that means is if they're overcalling, we should be value betting more because they're going to call with worse more often than they should be. So we should bet. They're also under betting their own hands. And they could be doing this because they're attempting to slow play. They could just be doing it because the general population at low limit poker is overly passive. They're not betting when they should because they're scared. They're not betting when they should because they don't realize that they should be protecting their hand or extracting value from you. They're just not betting enough. So what that means is if you have a monster hand and you check it hoping they bet, most of the time they're not going to bet. You're losing value in the long run. There are some times when it's okay to go for a check raise, and that's when it's pretty clear that your opponent likely does not have anything yet. For example, let's say you have pocket queens and the flop comes queen 9-9. You flopped a monster hand. This one's pretty obvious. It's very hard for your opponent to have a queen. It's very unlikely that they have a 9. They're probably only going to continue if they have a draw like Jack 10 or if there's a flush draw or an overpair or something like that. That's a spot where you can slow play your hand because your opponent doesn't have anything and maybe they will bluff at it or maybe you want them to catch up. But in general, if you have pocket queens and the flop comes out 10 high, you should value bet your hand. Tip number 3 is we're going to fold more to aggression. I already mentioned that this population is over passive in general. So if they're suddenly betting, usually that means that they have a hand. They're just not bluffing enough at low stakes poker. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're facing a big river bet or if they have double barreled or triple barreled against you, what are the chances that they're actually bluffing? Unless it's a known bluffer that is super blasty that you have history with, that you know does this a lot, most of the time the general population in 1-2, 1-3, and 2-5 no limit Hold'em just isn't bluffing enough. They're also, again, under betting their own value hand. So if they're betting, they like their hand. Deny the passive player's equity. Tip number 4 is to raise your buy-in more. You're going to be playing against a very passive population in general. You want to punish the limpers because they're playing too many hands at this level and they're not raising enough. What that means is they're limping too much. You get to play the hand from position. Most likely, these players don't understand the value of position. which means you can capitalize on that big time. And even if you raise and they call you, their range is capped, which means we know that they don't have a super strong hand, and you can continue the pot post flop in position. You're going to print money this way, trust me. And the fifth tip is understanding pot odds and the 4-2 rule. If you don't know what the 4-2 rule is, let me explain it to you. It is a simplified way to calculate what your equity is in the middle of a hand. So, for example, let's say you flopped a flush draw. We know that there are 13 spades in the deck. You have 2 in your hand. There's 2 on the flop. That means that there are 9 remaining spades left in the deck unaccounted for. Those are your outs, right? The 4-2 rule says that on the flop, you calculate the number of your outs by 4. So that's 9 times 4, which is 36. So you roughly have 36% equity in the hand. On the turn, let's say it's the same scenario. There's 2 spades on the board and you have 2 spades in your hand. You still have 9 outs, but instead of multiplying by 4, we're going to multiply it by 2. 9 times 2 equals 18. That means that your hand roughly has 18% equity. So now that we understand what the equity is with our hand, let's go back to the flush draw where we have roughly 36% equity on the flop. We know that we need at least a 2-to-1 pot odds to continue the hand in order to be slightly profitable in the long run. So if there is $100 in the pot, your opponent bet $100 as well. There's now $200 in the pot. It costs us $100. Then yes, that's a 2-to-1 ratio right there. We're going to take that because we know that 2-to-1 ratio is about 33% equity that's needed. We have 36% equity. We're going to be profitable slightly in the long run. The other thing that we want to look at is what our implied odds are and also our reverse implied odds. So implied odds means that we're looking at what the effective chip stacks are in the hand. If I have $2,000 in front of me, but my opponent only has $300 to start the hand, the effective stack is $300, which means that I know that the most I can win in this hand is $300. I have to factor that into my decision when I have a draw, whether or not it's worth it to call or not. There's also reverse implied odds, which is the exact opposite. Let's say we're in a multi-way pot. Let's say it's like 5-handed to the flop and you were in the big blind with 5-6 suited or something like that. You flop a flush draw and all of a sudden there's a bet, a raise, a call, and now it's back to you. We're probably just going to fold this because even if we called and made our flush, there's a very good chance that someone has a higher flush draw. And if we called here and made the flush, it's going to be pretty difficult for us to fold there. By then we're going to be pretty committed to the pot possibly, and it's just going to cost us more money. So that's reverse implied odds. So keep in mind of that always in the back of your head. But knowing your pot odds and knowing how to calculate what your equity is with the 4-2 rule will definitely help you guys. All right, so that wraps up today's video. I just went over the top 5 simplest poker tips that you can apply to your game so that you can start crushing 1-2, 1-3, and 2-5 live. No Limit Texas Hold'em. I hope it helps. Stay tuned. I got more videos coming. And yeah, good luck.